Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's program. My name is Katie Fleming, and I'm the Gallery Manager and Education Coordinator at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you to today's program, which is the first in a series of interviews conducted by undergraduate students about their research concerning community, culture, people. And today I'm really thrilled to have Emma Silver here with us, who will be interviewed by undergraduate research apprentice at the Hearst Museum, Andrew Sengkhamyong. And so without much ado, I'm just going to go over some Zoom best practices for today, as well as sharing a brief land acknowledgement before turning it over to our student speakers. So for today's program, we're in a Zoom meeting, so we'll ask you to keep your audio and video off for the duration of the program. That being said, we'd love for you to submit questions and comments during the beginning portion of today's program. You can do so by selecting my name from the drop-down menu in the chat and sending me a message, which I'll hold for our speakers at the end. I'll also open up the chat during the audience Q&A portion so that you can send your comments and questions directly to the speakers and all of the participants. If you need subtitles or transcription, we have enabled auto transcription of today's program. You can click the More button or the CC button, depending on your platform, and click transcription and then enable live transcription or enable auto transcription, which will allow you to see subtitles on your screen. If you have any other questions about Zoom, feel free to message them to me in the chat. And lastly, I just want to share a land acknowledgement. So we take a moment today to recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited from and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Here at the Hearst, we're working to recognize and grapple with our own specific origins and role within the university. Even before we existed as a museum, our collections began with projects that participated in and were made possible by campaigns of genocide waged against Native Californian people, ancestors whose descendants are still here alive with us today. As a museum, we want to acknowledge the pain our institution has caused and work to offer a meaningful apology. We aim to create new kinds of collaborative relationships in the present and future, which will affirm Indigenous sovereignty and hold ourselves accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. We want to offer an apology by transforming the museum into a site for justice, inclusion, anti-racist action, and Indigenous knowledge production. So with that, I'm really excited to turn it over to Andrew Sengkhamyong to introduce our speaker for today, who will present for about 15 minutes, followed by some moderated discussion between the two of them, between Andrew and Emma, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So Andrew, I'd like to turn the stage over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Katie. So my name is Andrew, and I would like to formally introduce UC Berkeley researcher Emma Silver. Emma is a second semester senior with a double major in political science and American studies. As a queer woman herself, an avid World War II buff, and musical theater fan, she found a way to combine these three facets of her life into a singular senior honors thesis. And now I'll pass it off to Emma.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today and for taking the time to listen to me talk about something that I really love. I wrote a whole 86 pages on it. So very excited to share it with you today. So basically, America has had a intimate and very long obsession with World War II, pretty much from its occurrence all the way to the present day, which is... It's very warranted, considering that World War II was this massive catalyst and turning point for the American society that we know today. And so what I am focusing on in what I focused on in my thesis and what I'll be talking about in my presentation today is how we have continually taken to the Broadway stage to kind of try to parse out our feelings on the subject of World War II and to process the trauma and the emotions that we experienced by going through this country-altering and ultimately world-altering event. And I will argue that one of the ways that we do this is through queer GI performance and discussion of a lot of general sexual anxieties, by which we use that as a through line to repeatedly try to parse out our feelings on World War II. And so this starts with the way that the war really served as this turning point for American gender roles. So it was a very malleable time. You had women who were going into jobs in factories, going out of the home for the first time, making wages for themselves for the very first time. And you also have these men who are being taken from, a lot of them, small towns that they've never left before, their homes, and being shipped all over the country and all over the world. And in doing so, they're thrust into this experience of these strong military bonds, these experiences where they're meant to rely on other men and at a distance from the rest of the world and the rest of the people that they know. And so they ultimately start to develop these very strong homosocial bonds within the military, from a combination of this constant movement, these feelings of estrangement from home, the gendered structure that inherently comes with the military. And so what you get, and this is something that people don't really talk about as much in terms of what we think of the modern queer community, as well as just a facet of World War II that doesn't really get discussed, but that this combination of factors led to a degree of liberation for experimentation for a lot of men within the military. And so you see, for the very first time, a community of queer people starting to form, a lot of people who maybe didn't know that they were gay before entering the military, or maybe knew that there was something different, or even men who still identified as heterosexual both before and after they left the military, had this kind of degree of experimentation that they were allowed within military life, and within this life where they were kind of traversing across the world and meeting new people and living in these gender segregated worlds, and with all this pressure of a massive military endeavor with death staring them in the face a lot of the time. And so we get the birth of this queer space within the military that is solidified mostly by this nomadic nature of military life. And so you get, for the very first time, standardized gay slang and culture. As somebody who, has a gay community in the Oakland shipyard base in the San Francisco area, is transferred across the world to Europe or to an island in the South Pacific, and talks to the people there, and starts to become this standardized culture. One of the biggest examples of that is the change from referring to themselves as homosexuals, which was a term coined by the American Psychiatric Association as a disease, to using the term gay, which hadn't really been used to describe men who slept with or were in love with other men up until this point. But it was standardized across the board once people started to realize that it wasn't a disease, and it was something that was burgeoning into this kind of community. And so we see that wartime repeatedly produces a space wherein Americans are more focused on national unity and protection than they are about some of these social rules. They tried to screen out queer people in the induction center, but often there was lots of queer activity happening in the military, and because of the need for lots of warm bodies to fight this war, we didn't really care that much. And a lot of military commanders looked the other way when it came to calling out this behavior or discharging people for it. And so one of the places in which these queer men and non-queer men found a space to express these queer inclinations was the soldier shows that they put on both on Broadway, as we'll see, and also in camps across the world. And one of the biggest components of these soldier shows was drag routines. And what I posit is that the use of these drag routines, though thinking about it now, it's hard for us to picture and imagine men in the 1940s acceptedly dressing up in drag and makeup and big fancy dresses in the military, and that being an acceptable practice. But I argue that because of the camp that's inherent in drag, which is this kind of over-the-top comedic feeling that you get from dressing up in this way, that it was used as a means of comedic detachment that queer men had been using for long before they entered the war, but that through the pervasiveness of drag, and especially the pervasiveness of drag shows during World War II, they were able to pass this comedic detachment tool onto the people in their military spaces, as well as we'll see with our first case study of This Is the Army, pass that comedic detachment onto an American public that really needed that space and really needed the ability to detach themselves from another impending world war after having just gone through one not that long ago. And so our first, like I said, our first case study will be This Is the Army. And so This Is the Army was produced during the war in 1942 and then was made into a movie in 1943. It was insanely popular. It was attended by hundreds of thousands of millions of Americans. It traveled across the world and across the United States. It was attended by the president of the time, FDR, and was heralded as American as the Bill of Rights. And it was used to raise money for the Army Relief Fund. And so one of the most important things about this show is that it takes this military drag culture and it puts it not only on a Broadway stage, but it also puts it into film, and it immortalizes it with Ronald Reagan starring in the film. And it becomes that you get this tool that was used by queer men and used by the military men who shared it with them as a means of comedic detachment that becomes passed on to the American public and becomes creates this lasting imprint on the American public and creates queer culture as an American culture and creates drag as an acceptable art form by which to use and to play with and to present on stage. And so what we see again, like I discussed before, is that war had effectively steeped American culture in this version of tolerance, one that forced them to decide what was more important, calling out the blatant queer culture and behavior that they were seeing on stage, or to enjoy the camp in all its distracting glory in a way that they desperately needed at the time of the war. And that's how they tried to parse out their feelings and their anxieties about this impending war, about the lives that would be lost. Presumably in the coming years. And so our second case study moves to just after the war. It's the musical South Pacific, which was put on stage in 1949 and was made into a movie in 1958. And so essentially what makes this musical important is that it is a wartime musical in which we really don't see a war. And we are attempting to process the war by not processing it all. We're doing the second stage, which is denial, and we're trying to backtrack all of the things and the feelings that the war made us feel, all the sadness, all the grief, and we're trying to box it up and kind of pretend that it didn't happen. And so that's how you get South Pacific, which is a wartime musical set on an island in the South Pacific following a group of Navy and Marine men who are stationed there. But the plot of the story does not revolve around the war, but it revolves around two twin relationships that both have to do with racial sexual anxieties and mixed gender relationships, mixed gender children, mixed racial children and mixed racial relationships. And those are the sexual anxieties that we are deciding to parse out in this musical. And so we're really using World War II as more of a cultural touchstone to backdrop a romantic story and present racial tensions in a way that was signaling to American audiences that the war was behind them. And these are the things that we were focusing on now, that these racial and sexual anxieties are the things that need to be at the forefront of the discussion now. We don't need to process the war. We don't need to talk about the war. We can focus on these other anxieties. And we can kind of try to put all the transgressions and all the things and all the women who became more independent and all these things. I don't have time to get into all of those examples, but and we can put them back in the box that they kind of were able to come out of. But what's important, especially about this musical in particular, is that the attempt to do this and the attempt in the 1950s and 60s of this kind of repression of the war and its traumas was not wholly successful. So we tried to erase all of these transgressions, the racial transgressions, the sexual transgressions, the queer transgressions that appear during the war, as described to you earlier, but we still get a drag number in this musical, because to erase this entirely from a wartime camp variety show, which is put on at the end of the musical, would have been completely disingenuous to the history of World War II, something that millions of Americans and millions of soldiers back home were very knowledgeable to. It just happened to them. So to put on a soldier show and not have somebody dressed up in drag would just be completely ridiculous to any American viewer watching it. But there is an attempt to, not use it as this unifying force that it was before. There's you have one person on stage who does it as opposed to groups of men, wherein This Is the Army, almost all of the drag presentations were done in large group numbers. Most of the group numbers in This Is the Army were drag numbers, whereas here you have a singular person dressed up on stage. She's kind of made fun of for doing it. And so we're trying to show that it's a joke, and that it's not this useful unifying tool that it was, and that the only reason why we had to do that was because men were on faraway bases where women weren't, and this was the necessity that we had to do at the time. But so we weren't able to fully erase this queer transgression from the war and from American culture. And so the war happened, and there's no denying that, but South Pacific argues that much of its effects can be forgotten, for women and interracial sexual taboos, but it falls short in its application of trying to erase the queer communities whose distinctive and visible wartime contributions proved much harder to erase just from in general. And then I know I'm running out of a little bit of time, but finally we have Bandstand, which is made in this post World War II era, which it was on the Broadway stage in 2017. And essentially the hallmark of the show, it focuses on the post-traumatic stress disorder that plagued many of the World War II veterans that returned home from the United States. It focuses on the Donny Nova Band and the way in which its veterans use music as a unifying and therapeutic force. And it serves as a vehicle to not just discuss the war and its effects, but to actually acknowledge them, and to acknowledge that burying these traumas and anxieties, as we did with This Is the Army and South Pacific, just isn't enough anymore. And the men in these musical, and what makes it so different from its predecessors, is that the men in this musical are able to articulate to an extent the pain and the trauma they're experiencing inside themselves. And there are scenes where the band members talk about the war experiences to each other. They have private moments of struggle in front of the audience. They scream and they cry in full view, and they lean on each other for emotional support in a way that's indicative of the show's attempt to provide a real and raw depiction of wartime trauma. That was partially achieved by working with veterans organizations and working with the Got Your Six certification organization, which helps to make sure that veterans and military men are portrayed in an accurate way on screen and on stage. And so how this ties into our sexual anxiety conversation, and the through line by which all three of these musicals are kind of saying something about the American public, is that doing these things does not make the men in this musical, who are all World War II veterans, the year's 1945, they've just gotten back from the war, it doesn't make any of them any less masculine or weak, or it doesn't make them weak by portraying these weaknesses. And therefore the musical is able to also put forth a queer representation in a subtle and normalized way in the form of the character Jimmy Campbell, who's one of the band members, and whose identity is not intended to disconnect him from the other characters. It's not intended to be a comedic relief for the audience or for the rest of the characters, but rather his overarching purpose is the same, in that he is trying to assess his wartime trauma along with the rest of the band. And so I argue that this is because, and through my research, what I found was something called the inclusive masculinity theory, which is a theory of social behavior that posits that gay male's social and legal acceptance into the mainstream, and a decreasing homophobia in heterosexual men in the 21st century has led to a parallel decrease in cultural homohysteria, which refers to straight men's fear of being socially perceived as gay, that in turn polices their gender behavior. And so, in this kind of post-homohysteric society in which none of these other musicals were made, we don't have to make fun of queer representation. We don't have to make fun of somebody in drag in order to make ourselves feel better about the things that we're feeling. We are in a space where we can be vulnerable, and men can be vulnerable on stage about the experiences that they went through without being feared that they're going to be perceived as gay. And so this is the environment in which Bandstand is able to discuss our war traumas, and able to, informed by these studies of PTSD done on Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq war veterans, and project that study onto the greatest generation and all of these millions of men returning from the war who suffered in silence with post-traumatic stress disorder that they didn't understand, that there was no vocabulary for, and into an American society that was really pushing this American victory narrative in which the economy was booming, we had won the war, we were a global superpower, and as this show opens, that everybody says that everybody wants to get back to just like it was before. But these men aren't able to do that. They've been through something that the people on the home front, though they fought a different kind of war, would never be able to experience and understand. And so Bandstand really tries to parse out those feelings and the isolation and loneliness that occurred for a lot of those veterans. And it essentially argues that music is the unifying force by which these veterans and other veterans like them are able to process those feelings and are able to quell a lot of these symptoms of the traumas that they're experiencing. And so, as the United States engages in more and more conflicts, it's important that as a society, we learn this lesson and that we can healthily handle trauma from its outset, instead of trying to sort through the compounded strain of not only the trauma itself, but the effects of the repression of that trauma, which we saw coming from the greatest generation, unfortunately. And so, as our nation matured, we were able to finally land in a place with Bandstand wherein we can work through our traumas without hiding behind sex and sexuality as buffers to discuss the other issues that occurred in the war. But we're not about the war in particular. And so we are now arriving at a place where we've figured out that the live and communal ability of musical theater is something like no other, and that being able to see people and interact with people on a stage in a way that you can't walk away from them like you could from a TV, and you can't put down them like you could to a book, creates a whole different kind of experience that allows us as Americans to have a collective experience and a collective conversation about the traumas we've experienced, and in particular these traumas following the massive American changing event of World War II.
Thank you so much for that, Emma. It's really amazing to see how passionate you are about your work, and I'm so happy you made the time to come out and share with us today. I am a bit curious to hear more about your experience throughout this process. One question that I had is, how did you get started with this research, and did you run into any troubles or difficulties while kind of navigating this virtual world?
Yeah, well, so what was it, last year ago, the summer before my senior year, I had gone to my professor to tell him about this musical, Bandstand, that I really, 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 really loved, because I'm a big old musical theater nerd. And I was taking a class of his on World War II. And so I went to my American Studies professor and I was just rambling to him about the plot and how important I thought it was and all these examples of things that I didn't have time to share with you guys today. But if you're interested, feel free to hit me up. And all these amazing things that I thought was so important. And he, the first thing he responds to me and says is, oh, so, it's like, Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans and their PTSD, and we're projecting it onto 1945. And I was like, record scratch. I was like, what? Because I just really loved the musical, but I had never thought about where it came from or why we were analyzing things in this way, or why now we had decided to take up the idea of World War II in a more analytical way, in a more realistic way than we had in the past. And so that kind of set me off on a path, and especially the American Studies department is great in that for your thesis, you basically get to write anything you want about American culture. And it set me off on this path in which he was like, if this is something you're passionate about, you can write about it for your senior thesis. And so I looked into more musicals about World War II, and I found, and when I went back to talk to my other advisor about it, I brought up to her like, yes, this musical, that musical, that musical, but you know what's funny? There's so much drag. There's so much drag in all of these musicals, and it's like 1942, or it's 1949. And we think of drag today as drag queens in West Hollywood, and or San Francisco and drag bars, and that's kind of what we imagine when we think of like a drag queen or something like that. And I was like, how is this socially acceptable? And not only socially acceptable, but men in the military in front of a big audience being socially acceptable for them to do these things. And so I was super interested by that question, because that just kept sticking out to me in all the musicals I watched. It like there was this huge drag component, and I just didn't understand why it was there, or why it was acceptable at the time. But yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I really love how it kind of just started from kind of like a minor inclination into something that you really wanted to explore. So that's really great. And then another question I had is, throughout this entire process, what would you say was the most defining moment for you?
I would say the most defining moment was when I had to cut a section of 14 pages out of my thesis. And this was 2 weeks before it was due. And so originally I had included the musical Cabaret in my research, because I really wanted to do something that was more a timeline and a time progression. So we had one during the war, one right in the post-war era, one around the 1970s, and one in the present day. The one around the 1970s would have been Cabaret. And I had my advisors read my thesis, and one of them made the comment that it felt more like I was making an argument about the GI queer component and that component versus the time component. And so he had recommended that I take out the section 2 weeks before my thesis would due, and would put me under the page count that I needed to be at, and I would need to add a lot more to the other sections. And I really thought my other advisor would be like, no, he's crazy, because she's my main advisor. And then I called her and she was like, no, I think he's right. And I cried, not gonna lie, it was a lot of work, that section. But ultimately, I decided that they were right, and that I would make a stronger argument by focusing more, because Cabaret is set right before the war, and it's set in Germany, and it's a really whole different vibe. If anybody knows anything about Cabaret, you'll know what I'm talking about. And so I really had to work to basically shift the entire focus of my argument to something not completely different, but something that wasn't the angle I had written the paper from originally. And I had to do that within 2 weeks of turning it in, because the American Studies department only does a 1 semester thesis. So yes, that was a defining moment for the paper, was having to do that. Oh God, pressing like command and then like delete to 14 pages, like it hurts you like really deep inside your soul. So
Yeah, I'm glad everything worked out in the end. Those are the questions that I had on my end. I think I'll pass it off to Katie for any questions that she might have received from the audience, as well as the chat box is also open.
Yeah, I want to thank you both for being a part of this conversation and recognize that we're a little bit over time, but welcome everyone to stick around for a few more minutes because I'd love to take some time to answer some of the audience questions and thank all of our audience members for being here today. So we're getting some great questions from the audience. The first one comes from an audience member who wants to share that they love the way that you're describing the evolution and progression of the musical post World War II, and is wondering whether you looked at Yank, even though it only made it to off Broadway, if that musical is on your radar.
I did look at Yank. The problem was, and this goes back to one of Andrew's questions before, which was doing research from home. I had always imagined writing my honors senior thesis from my childhood bedroom. So, that was, so fun without access to any in-person libraries or anything like that. So I did really want to include Yank in the thing, in my research. The problem was I couldn't find a stage production, and I didn't have easy access to the movie. And because the majority of the majority of the research is based on the onstage musical aspect of it, and that the fact that I really used the movie versions of these musicals to kind of supplement the onstage production, and even then Bandstand was only the onstage production. It was just a filmed version of the onstage production, was that I wouldn't be able to accurately assess the onstage components of Yank, because there wasn't really easy access to things like the scripts or the stage directions or stuff like that. So unfortunately, that's why I wasn't able to include that, and actually a few other musicals because of that. But yeah.
We have another audience question. Someone who's wondering what was the most surprising or exciting piece of information that you uncovered as part of your research?
Surprising.
Or unexpected, perhaps.
Unexpected. What's unexpected? Well, like I was talking about before, the drag in all these musicals, because again, it wasn't present in the musical that had launched me on this journey, which was Bandstand. But I think something surprising that came out of it was that the more you watch things over and over again, the more you see from them. So even as somebody who loved Bandstand so much, loving it and watching it over and over again, as I did on my own personal time because I'm crazy, is much different than watching it and trying to analyze it. And so there was this musical that I'd seen 100 times, but when I was watching it to analyze it, I would pick up all of these different things, and it made me realize just how rich this musical was, and how intentional a lot of the things is. One of the big things I didn't get to share about Bandstand that was one of my favorite things is that the way that they show these kinds of, the way that they talk about PTSD is in a way that they don't use dialogue. It's through these spotlight scenes in which the lighting and the mood of the scene changes, sometimes in the middle of another scene, sometimes with its own scene in its own right. And there's almost virtually no dialogue during this point, in a way that was very indicative of the fact that a lot of these men were suffering in this kind of silence by themselves, and they were experiencing it, and we can watch them experience it, but they weren't talking about it, and there was no discussion about it, and that often it happened in the middle of everything else that was happening. And some of these spotlight scenes are whole minutes long, and some of them last 4 seconds, and the lights go off and then they come back on, but you're able to read into that this is a scene, that something has just happened, that this isn't just this guy is drinking a drink, but he's not drinking a drink because he's just sitting there drinking a drink and it's fun. We know that by the lighting change that this is a consequence of his post-traumatic stress disorder, that he's drinking because he's an alcoholic, not just because he's at a bar and he's deciding to drink. We're being cued into the fact that there's something different here going on that we can't verbalize and that they can't verbalize, but we're able to see now, like, was there and is something different.
Thank you. This is also great, and helping kind of fully understand your research and thinking about the way we understand media kind of beyond just something for us to be entertained by, that it's really saying deeper things, holding up a mirror to our society as time moves on. I think for a closing question, I'm going to try and do my best to combine a few questions that have come in thinking kind of about past, present, and future. We had one question come in and asking about whether you had done much research on the history of theater in terms of men primarily being actors in communities, and whether that had some bearing on your understanding of soldier shows. So that's kind of the first part of the question, thinking about like pre-soldier shows, pre-Broadway theater. Then a question is coming in about how all of this plays in your understanding into nation making in America. Like, what does this say about this combination of queer culture and musical theater and the military? About, did it play into kind of people's understanding of who we are as Americans? And then the last question was, do you ever think the military will be able to reckon with the reality of their LGBTQ community? And kind of what do you see as the future for this kind of intersection of queer life in the military and theater? That was a big question, but maybe if you can just share some words with us about kind of the past, present, and what you see as the future before we close for today.
Yeah, so I did not do a whole lot of research about just the musical theater community. I have taken a class about the history of Broadway musical theater though, so I did have a little bit of that foundation going in. But in terms of the past, one of the things that I did talk about in my thesis was that I talked a lot about soldier shows and how they were a big thing in the military. You get This Is the Army and all of this stuff, but that there were also soldier shows and drag present in World War I, that this was a military tradition, that in the opening line of one of the opening songs of This Is the Army says, a lot of water's gone across the dam since we put makeup on for Uncle Sam to treat you as our fathers treated you then. So it is a paternal kind of tradition. It's not something that has popped new out of World War II. It's something that already existed, but what's important about the World War II aspect of it, and important about something like This Is the Army that I tried to emphasize, is that it happened in World War II and people knew about it. This Is the Army was technically an extension of Irving Berlin's first musical, Yip Yip Yap Hank, which was made during World War I. It was another soldier show made during World War I. But that the sheer size and the sheer, the sheer acceptance and like reverence of This Is the Army and the celebration of it cemented this queer tradition, not only within the military, but with the greater American public. So some people saw Yip Yip Yap Hank. I think it was on Broadway for a short period of time, but nothing to the extent that like This Is the Army really integrated itself into like American life and American culture, and was, cited as like catching the American pulse, that it was just so American and that like everyone needed to see it. The president went to see it, that the commander-in-chief went to go watch his soldiers put on this play in a way that previous drag and in previous soldier shows didn't really have that kind of reception. So that's in terms of past, a lot of what I thought was so important and interesting about this is kind of a turning point. Not that these things didn't exist and didn't exist in the military for this point, but this was the turning point for when people actually saw it and accepted it and revered it for what it was. And then the question about the present, I forget what was the meat of that second part of the question?
Yeah, just how do you think that this history has contributed to kind of American nation making and identity making more broadly, and then what do you see as the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, it definitely highlighted, at least to me, that queer culture is ingrained in American culture. It is, like I said, with This Is the Army, it was the foundation of a musical that was said to be as American as the Bill of Rights. And that if you look hard enough, you can find queer culture in American culture, and having made American culture pretty much everywhere. I mean, if you've ever watched the film The Celluloid Closet, which describes how queer people kind of have appeared in film throughout the years, you see it's a lot of coding and then a lot of not coding. It's a lot of outright making fun of somebody for being a quote unquote sissy, or dressing up in women's clothing or something like that. While also having characters that are coded that way. So when you look at like American culture and the way we've like made our nation, we've always built it on the backs of other cultures and of minority cultures and of cultures that we wanted to take from but didn't want to hold up, both to the light and both to hold up in terms of like to revere them, but wanted to take the things that we liked about them and wanted to take things like the comedic detachment and the camp that you're able to get from drag shows and the fun and the detachment. And a lot of what I used for that portion of the paper was Susan Sontag's notes on camp, and how camp is all these different things, but at its core, it's something that we use to be over the top because we can, to be authentic because we can, to detach ourselves from a harsh reality in order to have a little bit of fun. And so we do all those things, and we found different ways to employ camp in a way that it's always going to be inherently queer, but like in a way that was not as obviously queer. But I think we've always kind of picked these little things from cultures that we didn't want to talk about as much, but we wanted to use those components to kind of build ourselves and build the things around us, and the way we wanted it to be. And as for the future, I won't speak too much on it just because I did a lot of work more on the past than on like the present of the military future. But I think it's very hard in this, a lot of the military nowadays, it's very hyper masculine, which it's always been, but in a way today that feels different than it was in the past. And I think it's going to be less about the military accepting gay people and queerness, and more about society as a whole, and it becoming less of a societal roadblock to certain things, kind of what I talked about in the inclusivity masculinity theory, which is the more accepted queer people are in the mainstream society and the like legal mainstream, the more things, the more legal provisions they get, the more society accepts them, then the less people feel the need to protest so hard that they aren't them. You don't want to be somebody who's, you don't want to associate yourself with somebody who's oppressed, with somebody who's oppressed or somebody who's looked down upon or somebody who's discriminated against or othered. You don't want to be associated with that person. You don't want to act in a way that's going to make people think that you're that kind of person or that you're associated with that kind of person. But once that person becomes somebody who is not as oppressed, who you're not afraid to be associated with, who you're not afraid to, be called gay, it doesn't mean anything to you to be, referred to as gay. It's not a bad thing. You just say, no, I'm not, and then you move on. I think that's where you're going to get progression in a lot of these hyper masculine spaces, not just the military, but things like sports and other things like that, where the social fear of being perceived as gay genders that behavior. And so like moving past that and allowing gay people to kind of have that like mainstream thing will decrease that will further decrease that homo hysteria that we see in not just our American society, but societies all over the world.
Thanks for that. I wanted to just share and close with a message from an audience member who shared that the description you gave of lighting in your answer to one of the previous questions made them really miss live theater. And it sounds like that's something that you are missing, is access to physical spaces, access to in-person experiences of these resources. So I hope we're able to all return to that soon. It's been wonderful to share this virtual space with both of you and with our audience today. And I I wanted to thank Andrew for the development of this series and the planning of today's event. I wanted to thank Emma and congratulate you for completing this work and sharing it with our audience today. And I hope you go on to continue to do whatever research inspires you, both you, Emma, and Andrew. So I'm seeing some cheer emojis from the audience. So thank you, everyone. I think we'll close with that. And I wish everyone a wonderful rest of their day. And thank you for being here.